We also want to give a shout out to our listeners in Canada, Italy, Singapore, and the UK, and all across the U.S. We want to also give a shout out to Latoya Brannon in Savannah, Georgia. Thank you for being one of our biggest fans. Latoya never misses an episode. And we thank you, Latoya.
Love you, Latoya, out there. Listen, on Speak Out World, we love introducing amazing artists from all genres. And on today's show, we're going to hear from Mila Konomis, an amazing poet whose latest project is inspired by the Korean art form of storytelling called pansori. All right?
Yes,
I hope I got that right.
It's going to be a great show. So stay tuned, and we will be right back with more of Speak Out World.
Welcome, everyone, and we have an amazing guest with us today. She's an artist, she's a poet, and she is here to share with us a real personal story about her life and how it transitioned her into an artist, and talk about this new project she has coming up, Empress Han. Mila, welcome.
Hello.
Yes.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited.
We are so excited to have you on. Listen, for those who don't know, I've had the great opportunity of being able to see her perform her artwork, her poetry, and she has just been an artist I've been really dying to wanting to have on our podcast show. So I'm so glad that you're here. I am so glad that you're here. I want to jump into a particular talk about your life, really kind of growing up, because you have this experience with transnational and transracial adoption. And so I just want to get right into that. For those who don't know, what does it mean to be transnational, or what does a transracial adoption mean for those who are out there listening?
Yeah, so transracial, transnational adoption, transracial refers to being adopted across races by a different race, basically, than you identify. And then another layer on top of that is transnational adoption, meaning you are adopted from a different country than the one that you're currently living in. So I am a Korean American adoptee, meaning I was adopted from Korea by specifically a white American family. So there's the racial difference as well as the difference in country. I was born in Korea, but adopted by an American family.
So you were adopted as a baby. So you didn't know anything else. How did that, I guess let me just really get to the real point.
Yeah,
when did you know, okay, something is different here, in terms of your identity and trying to, just trying to relate to the community that you were raised in?
So it started very early. I'd say that for a lot of adoptees, but I think for me personally, it started once I started attending school. So my family actually, they're white American, but also a military family. So we often lived on military bases that were predominantly white communities. And a lot of times, even if we were living overseas, we were living on a military base that was primarily white American families. So I actually remember the first time I became painfully aware that I was not seen in the same way. And I think up until attending school, it wasn't necessarily, I was so young, I don't remember, but I remember the first time I got made fun of at school. And there was a group of kids that were pulling up their eyes and saying things like ching chong, and I remember at first kind of looking like this, like, who are they talking to? Are they talking to me? Because I wasn't aware yet, because, I was a child. And so we didn't have discussions about race in my white American family. And so I remember like kind of just being confused initially, and then eventually got home and was looking in the mirror, and kind of over time was like, I think they were making fun of me. I think they were talking to me. And so kind of from that point on, I became increasingly aware of the fact that I was not white, and that was perceived as a negative thing in the communities that I was growing up in.
So Mila, how did your childhood story impact your becoming the writer that you are today?
That is a great question, Dino. So really, I can easily say that my journey and my experience as a Korean American adoptee, as an Asian person, really forced to live in a predominantly white community, informs pretty much all of my art. I think it's inextricable. And I first started writing, I think as a way to just work out my feelings, kind of as like therapy. Obviously, I didn't know that at that time, but at a very young age, I started writing poetry, and also I had a diary, and I would write about that and write about how I felt different, because this wasn't something that I could really talk about with my family. And I have this one poem saved from when I was 9 years old, and in the poem, it's like I have drawings around the poem itself, but the poem is really intense when I go back and read it, because I was 9 years old. And what I wrote about was this flower that had been pulled out of the dirt and transplanted and planted into another soil. But over the seasons, it didn't survive and it died, but then later came back as something new. And I had pictures that I had drawn in the margins of like a flower alive and then dying and coming back to life. But I remember reading that later on in adulthood and just being like, oh my gosh, I was so intensely processing my experience even then, but I just didn't have the language or the awareness to do that, because at the time that I was adopted in the 70s, the predominant kind of teaching to white adoptive families was don't talk about it. Just act like it's normal. You don't need to have conversations about it, and which is actually very detrimental. It is. Because kids, they notice everything, and so. But that was what families were told to do, and so I just had everything pushed so far down. But writing and art became a way for me to let out what I felt like I couldn't let out with my family or my friends.
What you were speaking through your art was prophetic. You were actually demonstrating through art what was going to occur in your life. It appears to me, because now that flower, that rose that has come back, is something else.
Yeah, that's totally blossomed and bloomed. You bloomed where you were planted to be able to give to others.
Thank you.
I mean, when you talk about finding your art form at an early age and writing this poem, was that the beginning of the time in your life around that same time when you really started to investigate about your nationality and where you came from and, why am I different?
Yeah, so, I think my journey has been really long and complicated and nonlinear. And honestly, I think because of the environment that I was in, I did not actually feel at liberty to really seek out my origins. It wasn't until in adulthood, quite honestly, once I got out from under my parents' roof and went to college and kind of got out on my own, that's when I really started to seek it out more. But even still, I think I felt very repressed and very disempowered because I was afraid that by searching for my origins, I was being disloyal to the people that had quote unquote saved me. And transracial, transnational adoption, the way that I frame it now, it really is rooted in white American imperialism, colonialism. It's really this process of erasing the child of color's origins and identity and trying to whitewash them in a way to be complicit in this system. I was kind of like this token that could be paraded around and almost like this symbol of not only have we colonized her, but we have colonized the nation that she's from. And I think that that's sometimes difficult for people, especially white adoptive parents, to hear because they don't like being viewed that way, right? But with transracial, transnational adoption, what a lot of people don't make the connection to is that this is something that dates back to when this quote unquote country was founded. Obviously, there were thousands, millions of people here already who had their own nation.
Native Americans.
Yes, and the indigenous people. And when the colonizers came here, eventually they started separating indigenous children from their families and communities, sending them to these quote unquote re-education camps or forcing them to live with white European families, specifically for the purpose of westernizing indigenous people and trying to erase their heritage and their origins. So even though that was within these borders, it was still transracial and transnational because indigenous people had their own nations, their own culture, their own practices. And then in the 1950s, World War II, there was some international adoption that happened with Germany and Greece and Japan. But really in the 1950s with the Korean War, that's when thousands of Koreans started being adopted out en masse. And by the time my generation came along, they were exporting us in just droves to the point now that there are 200,000 of us worldwide, about half of us residing in the States. So I think this process of erasure was so effective, and I didn't feel like I had permission to go out and seek that. So once I became an adult, I became more curious, but it really wasn't until searching and reuniting that I feel like I really truly started to embrace and kind of reclaim my Koreanness, my Asianness, and my origins. That gave me the courage to finally try to start to match up those things, because for so long I honestly was just afraid. I was afraid to seek out my origins because I think there was so much of it that was rooted in so much loss and grief and trauma that in order to do that, I had to face that as well.
Yeah, I believe some of our listeners will be able to identify with you too, Mila. Mila, listen, what is at the core of your art, writing, and activism?
Oh, that's a good question. I think at the core, obviously my experiences as a transracial, transnational adoptee really inform and are what have compelled me. But I think at the core, I really like to, so my activism is a way of reclaiming my identity and my origins, and my art and activism are inextricable from each other. They're the same thing for me, but I think what's important about it for me is I get to decide, it's a way of self-empowerment, and it's a tangible way for me to reclaim what was taken from me, and to be able to say, this is how I am going to define my story and my narrative, because there's so much in the adoption community. White adoptive parents have traditionally been given power and control over the narrative. And we as adoptees are often told we need to be grateful, we need to be quiet. And if we speak up, we're labeled as angry, we're labeled as ungrateful, we're labeled as, unstable or pathological, or a lot of times we're treated as children. Like we don't know what we're talking about, even though we're in our 40s and married and have children.
Wow,
you know what I mean? So I think for me, my art, at the core of my art and activism is self-empowerment and really saying, look, I get to say what my story is, and I get to say who I am. And my hope too is that other adoptees or even other people who relate to that also feel empowered to do the same, to say, no one else gets to control my story. No one else gets to control my narrative. It belongs to me.
I want you to share with the audience as well your journey as you start to reclaim your identity and what happened as you begin to research finding your birth parents. Because I'm sure they're out there listening like, did she find them or what happened? So tell us.
So I actually really love telling this story because it's just, to me, even every time I tell it, I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this. But so I reunited with my Korean family in 2009, so over a decade ago. But the search was really involved. It was a 7-year process. And the way it happened essentially was I had a friend, Melinda, who was working at the time in adoption for an adoption agency. She made copies of my papers, and she had a neighbor who was actually Korean who had volunteered for one of the largest adoption agencies in the world, Holt International, which I have issues with them. But anyway, so he kind of took the information she had, and he was like, well, we can't help her, but I have a colleague who works for this other agency that may be able to help her. So her name was Dakyoung and Melinda eventually connected me with her, and Dakyoung was like, yeah, sure, we can try to search. So through this 7-year process, it was really painful and difficult because there were times where emotionally I just felt like I couldn't handle the limbo and not knowing what was going to happen. And I think there were times that I just was like, I just can't do this anymore. And there were times I would stop. But I think in my heart, it's like I wanted to know the truth, whatever that truth was. If they were dead, if they didn't want to have anything to do with me, like I just wanted to know the truth. I think that's ultimately what really drove me. I wasn't looking for a happy ending. I was just looking for the truth. I wanted to know, where did I come from, which I think is a very human desire. And so eventually in 2009, I was driving in my car, and what's crazy is I don't have it on right now, but in my wedding band, one of the stones had fallen out, and I thought I had lost it forever, but my husband had found it sitting on our kitchen counter. So I had taken the stone and the ring to the jeweler to get it fixed. Well, that day, and I had picked it up from the jewelers. I was in my car and my phone rang, and I picked it up, and it was Dakyoung. And she said, and she never called me. She always emailed me. So I knew she had big news. And she said, are you sitting down? I said, no, I'm in the car. And she was like, well, why don't I wait until you get home? And I was like, no, I'm going to pull over. So I pulled over into a parking lot, and she said, well, I wanted to let you know that we have found not only your Korean mother, but we have also found your Korean father. And I just lost it. I lost it because it's really rare for a Korean adoptee to find the father as well. It's already really rare to find your mother, but that they had found both, even though I hadn't even specifically said, please find both. So that was in 2009. But what is so crazy is the way they found them, Dakyoung told me, was my Korean mother, my Omma's younger brother, was in Seoul, South Korea, eating some noodles at a restaurant. And he looked out the window and saw a man walking by that reminded him of his older sister's boyfriend from like 20 years ago. So he decided to jump up and chase the guy down and kind of, hey, stop for a second. Is your name said the name, and he was like, yeah, that's me. And he got my appa's, my Korean father's phone number and passed it along to my oma. This was in November. My oma got the call from the adoption agency in December of that same year, so a month later.
Wow.
She just happened to have my appa's phone number and contact information after 7 years of the adoption agency searching for her. So I got the call in January 7th from Dakyoung, and she told me all of this. We did DNA testing to confirm, and they're definitely my parents, and I look exactly like my appa, like my Korean father. I'm just like a female version of him. It's wild, actually. When I first saw his photo, I was like, oh my gosh. Even my oma, like, they're not together, you know, but when she saw my photo, she's like, oh my gosh, she looks exactly like her father.
Wow.
So that's how we ultimately ended up connecting. My husband and I this was before we had kids. We traveled to Korea that summer and reunited with each one of them individually. And then I've kept in touch with them since then using Kakao Talk and Google Translate because I don't speak Korean. I just know probably the level of a 1-year-old. So.
What was it like when you first saw them, and what were the emotions like?
I mean, I just bawled my eyes out. I think because, for adoptees, we spend our entire lives not knowing what it's like to feel that connection to someone that is blood, that is DNA. We don't know what it's like to have anyone reflect back to us, not just physically, but even personality wise. I grew up in a family that's very traditional, not artists, military, nurse, which, that great, but that just isn't me, And so I think when I first connected with them, and I think in particular with my appa, he and I are so alike. And I think it's just been so validating and affirming, and really a huge part of that I contribute to my ability to blossom and to come out of my shell, realizing that I'm the way that I am because that's who I came from. I think for so long I felt like an alien. I felt like there was something wrong with me. I felt like I didn't fit in. I didn't belong anywhere, but as I got to know my family more and my origins, I started realizing there's nothing wrong with me. I just grew up not knowing that there were other people out there like me. So it was just very emotional, and it's still emotional. I mean, I look at this as a journey, and finding my origins and my family it's just like another chapter, but it definitely, I think a lot of times when people think about adoption reunion, they think, oh, good, the story's done. You've tied it up in a nice bow. And it's like, no. It opens a whole other Pandora's box where you have so many other questions. There are other layers of grief that rise to the surface. I mean, it is a lifetime journey. But I don't regret it at all. Sometimes people ask, do you regret searching and reuniting? Because it does bring up new pain. And when you find out some of the details, it's painful, Sometimes not knowing is better because you can fantasize, right? And you can make up your own story, but then once you know the truth, it's like, well, that's the truth. And you can't make up anything anymore. But I don't regret it all. I'll take this kind of pain versus the pain of not knowing.
Well, it took you 7 years to complete. 7 years is completion. And you completed your task.
Yes. I want to, if you don't mind sharing, or however much of this part of the story you feel comfortable with sharing with our listeners, what was the story behind why your parents gave you up for adoption?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think sheds a light on not only my own experience, but kind of transracial, transnational adoption as a whole. And so, before getting into the details, I'll say that the reason was poverty, stigma, a lack of resources and really white supremacy and colonialism. So I think those are all the things that intersected for this to happen. But I think what it is that, so in Korea specifically, there's still, even in the 21st century, is a heavy stigma around becoming pregnant outside of marriage. So at the time when I was adopted in the 1970s, my Korean parents, they met in junior high school, actually became best friends, and that turned romantic. And then they eventually, they found out that she was pregnant with me. They actually were in their 20s, so they weren't even children at that time. But they moved in together, and all of this without their parents knowing. But unfortunately, what happened at the time was my Korean father was imprisoned. And so he, at the time, was a part of the crime syndicate in Korea. It's really massive. It's heavily tied to construction in Korea, too, because land there is such a pricey commodity. Sometimes they'll use kind of illicit means to push people out, to kind of like gentrification in the United States. So,
wow. Okay.
Yeah. But he unfortunately was imprisoned, and my Oma at that time, as a single mom, did not have any resources or means to provide. So her older sister basically said, "You need to give this child up. You need to leave him behind. You need to give this child up, and then you're going to do it the right way, and you're going to get married like a respectable person and have a family and move on and forget all about this." And the way my Oma told me was I had to do what she said because she was like God to me. So in that culture, you listen to your older sibling, and whatever they tell you to do, you do it. And so, but again, where this all intersects is that she was poor, she was uneducated. There were no support resources in Korea. They don't have resources or programs there to help women. And so at that time, she literally, no one would have hired her in Korea. Even now in Korea, they can fire you or refuse to hire you if they find out that you're a single mom. I mean, the quote unquote women's rights in Korea are dismal, and they're trying to work on it. A lot of that being propelled by first mothers and adoptees who have kind of expatriated to Korea. But so I think she felt like she didn't have a choice, and she really didn't. I have adoptee friends whose mothers tried to take care of them for several years and ended up giving the child up after maybe 3 or 4 years because they were afraid the child would die. And in my mind, I'm like, okay, clearly these women love their children. They wanted to take care of them. So there should have been resources to assist them and empower them because they clearly wanted that. So I think but because of America's presence in Korea due to invasion and war, kind of these white Christian missionaries moved in there and said, sure, we'll take your children, instead of saying, oh, wow, you clearly love your child. Let's help you. Let's see
what services we can provide for you, how we can, eliminate the stigma of this. Yeah.
Right. And empower them, like family preservation. I absolutely believe family preservation should be the first top choice before anything else, because most of the time, if you will give the resources and support to mothers, they will choose to keep their children. As a mom myself, I'm like, of course.
Right.
So my Appa actually didn't know anything about the fact that my Oma had relinquished me for adoption. So according to him, and their stories line up, even though they told them independently, while he was in prison, some of his brothers, like his gang brothers, came and visited him, and he asked them to go to my Oma in the apartment that they had been living together and bring her to him at the prison to visit him, and he was going to try to set her up so she would be okay once she gave birth to me, because he was imprisoned, I think it was just a month before I was born, actually. So he was imprisoned in May and I was born in June. And so, but his brothers came back to him and said when they went to the apartment that my Oma was no longer there. And so that is because her sister, her older sister, had basically told her she had to leave and leave her boyfriend, her child's father, and she was going to be relinquishing me for adoption. So when my Appa was devastated by that. And when he got out of prison a year later, he told me that he searched for my Oma, thinking that, you know, she had given birth to me and that he could find them and they could be reunited and be a family. But I think it took him about 2 or 3 years to finally locate my Oma. And when he did, she was already married with children. And so, you know, they met in secret. And he was absolutely devastated when he found out, when she told him, I'm sorry, I don't have our daughter anymore, and I'm married and have children. And I think it took him a while to recover because the wife that he currently has, I don't think he got married until like several years later because I have a half brother and a half sister. And I think the brother is like 5 years younger than I am, and the daughter is 7 years younger than I am. Mm-hmm. So it took him a while to get over that. He just wasn't expecting that.
Wow. That is so, just so amazing, even understanding, again, connecting back with identity, not just who your parents, who they were, but also understanding their love story and the circumstances that happened that led to your adoption, and the fact that it wasn't about that you weren't loved, you weren't wanted, you know. It was about the time and the circumstances, and he tried to go back and set your mom up and set you all up so that you can be a family. But I'm sure that was devastating for him to know as well that not only will I not see my child again, but now my child has been adopted overseas on top of that. Let's talk about your work when it comes to your poetry and the Empress Han, and explain to our viewers what does that mean, Empress Han, and how that ties in with your journey with being a Korean adoptee and your art.
Yeah, so Empress Han is something that has really just kind of started to evolve organically as I've been processing my journey. And it's funny, it's actually kind of a result of the pandemic because, because, you know, obviously this has been really challenging circumstances. And with my kids being home, having to do virtual school, my husband's also been working from home and not having the same kind of mobility, being able to go out and do things at nights after the kids were going to bed. I was just kind of, writing and creating as a kind of therapeutic, just trying to give my feelings and things a space as trying to navigate through the pandemic. And I found a lot of what I was doing was continuing to process my journey as a Korean adoptee. And so there's this concept called Han in the Korean language, which is referred to as Hangul. And it is this idea and experience within the Korean collective, often defined as a traumatic loss of identity. It's also often referred to as this kind of deep, intense longing and angst connected to unresolved injustice, pain, and suffering. And this experience and concept of Han is thought to originate from a couple of things in Korean history. So Korea was actually invaded and colonized by the Japanese between 1910 and 1945. And so Japan actually claimed Korea as a territory and occupied Korea. They forced Koreans to speak only Japanese. They had to take on Japanese names. They were not allowed to practice any Korean customs or traditions. Otherwise, they could be imprisoned or executed. So, I think there's that. And then also the Korean War, when China / Russia and then the US / Europe kind of had a proxy war essentially in Korea. And that's what ended up in Korea being divided and split in two, whereas now there's North Korea and South Korea. So these experiences are kind of, embedded in the Korean psyche and the people, because families were separated during the Korean War, and they've never seen each other again. So you had husbands and wives who were separated, children and parents who were separated, and never able to see each other again. And then, of course, during the Japanese occupation, losing and trying to fight to retain that identity, but knowing that you could die or be imprisoned or separated from your family if you try to assert that identity. But what I find so ironic is that Korea, after experiencing that intense trauma, inflicted that upon their own people by separating mothers from their children because of the cultural stigma around that. So I think that speaks to that kind of generational trauma that is carried through, that if you don't deal with that, if you don't face that trauma, you end up repeating it. You end up inflicting that on the ones that you love. And so I think that Han, for me, is this concept that while it applies to the Korean nation, as a Korean adoptee, it's so relevant, right? I've had this traumatic loss of identity, being erased by my own people, though, right? They sent me away because I was born to a woman who wasn't married. And yet they experienced such traumatic loss of identity through Japanese occupation and family separation. So I think that that's something through Empress Han. That's why I chose Han, because this is a concept that is so central to my experience. But then the idea of Empress is kind of that reclamation that I've been talking about, where it's like, you know what, I am going to reclaim this and make this my own. I am sovereign over my pain, over my suffering, over my loss, over my grief. And instead of it being something that I'm ashamed of or that destroys me or that pulls me down, I am going to use it to empower myself. I am going to use it to do something creative, something that's beautiful rather than something that's destructive. And I have to say that I need to give credit to all the amazing people who have gone before me or who are in my life currently. And, honestly, it's been a lot of Black women who have taught me this, who have taught me to embrace and to feel empowered by who I am and what I've been through, that the trauma and the loss that I've experienced, even the anger, even the rage that I feel at times, or the hurt and the pain that I feel, is something that can be used in a powerful and meaningful way. I love Audre Lorde. I have her collection of essays, and I go back to that so often because I think just her way of framing, whether it's racism or anger. I mean, she was a poet herself.
Exactly. And an activist. Exactly.
Yeah. So she really, under all of it, inspires me. And there are a lot of other artists out there, both Black and Asian, who inspire me. But Empress Han is just this embodiment and expression of really asserting and claiming sovereignty over our own individual identities and narratives, and not being afraid of our pain and our suffering, and being empowered by that and seeing that you can make something from that.
I wanted to follow up on that. You noted that you were focusing on art and activism. on your work of co-liberation and immigrants, communities and communities of color through the Atlanta Radical Art Community and Adoptees for Justice. Can you talk a little about that?
Yeah, sure. So, Atlanta Radical Art and Adoptees for Justice, obviously two separate organizations. Atlanta Radical Art is just this, it's a local collective founded by Rosina Galani. And it's basically this community where radical artists can come together and it's use their art for activism and working toward the liberation of all people. So it is focused on building solidarity and focused on being inclusive of all communities, obviously really embracing true diversity and inclusion. And then Adoptees for Justice is a group of international adoptees, actually, who are working toward also solidarity with a focus on immigrant justice, but also inclusive of other marginalized communities. But specifically right now, Adoptees for Justice is working on the Adoptee Citizenship Act, because what a lot of people don't know is that there are an estimated thousands, I think tens of thousands of adoptees in the United States that their parents never obtained their citizenship. So they are facing deportation, and they're actually adoptees from several dozen countries who have already been deported. One of them, his name is Adam Krapser, and he is a Korean adoptee, same age as me, still has his kids here. He was deported, and he's not allowed to come back. And so what the Adoptee Citizenship Act would do is it would allow deported adoptees, regardless of their status or background, so if they have a criminal background, they would be allowed to return and have a legal pathway to citizenship. And the Adoptee Citizenship Act would also allow adoptees currently residing in the states who don't have citizenship to have a pathway to citizenship. So it hasn't passed yet, but you can imagine in this current environment and context, it's been very difficult. So that's the main campaign and project that Adoptees for Justice is working on currently, but it's definitely a community and an organization that is all about building solidarity across different communities impacted by the systems that imprison and detain, a lot of our different communities.
I'm so glad that you joined us on Speak Out World to be able to share your experience and share your stories. And sometimes, even as an African American, I mean, I must really be transparent and admit that because our history in America is just so deep. And the amount of time, the centuries of being part of this systemic racism and having our families torn apart and the identity, I think when you reflect back and you said so many Black women helped you is because so many Black people of African descent whose ancestors were brought here as slaves, right, can't even go back to trace where their origins and that frustration and having that identity and so identity is truly connected among several different ways in our lives. It's connected to our parents. It's connected to the region that we were born in. It's connected to the region that we were raised in. And so I think we're all finding a bit of that imprison in terms of finding out who we are and our identity and, in that regard. And so and it's just something that you just, okay, let me just speak for me. I don't know about you, Dino. I mean, but it's something that sometimes I just have not given enough thought to in terms of other people's pains in terms of being a transracial during transracial adoption. It just sometimes it just seems like, well, you were adopted by white parents. It just seems like you have it just so much easier, than growing up Black in America. But it is important that we continue to have this dialogue and to be able to share our stories with one another, because it goes back to we realize we have more in common than we do, than is separating us.
And I think your words were so encouraging, Mila, because there are a lot of children who have accepted responsibility for the fact that they have been adopted, not knowing the real reasons why it occurred, but they take that pain upon themselves. And it's just a blessing to hear you explain that your trial to understand who you are was long. It was, it was agonizing, but it was a part of who makes you who you are today.
Yes.
And be able to help others understand that they have value and worth, even though they may not see it. So that's so important that you continue to tell your story, because your story is so valuable.
Thank you.
Yes, and so powerful. And before we close out, because we're running out of time, and we have the most amazing guest on Speak Out World. I'm going to say that, like, every time we have a guest on, we have to have him back. We need more time. There's more to talk about. But what advice would you give to someone that's listening and they have adopted a child from another race, from another country, and what advice would you give to them as parents?
Let me throw this last question in, Joelle. What are you most proud of that you're working on or that you've worked on in the past?
The advice, and this is going to be hard for some people to swallow, if I'm going to sum it up, love is not enough. And what I mean by that is that no matter how much you love your child, that love does not automatically heal the inherent trauma and pain that the adoptee carries with them. And so you have got to take it upon yourself as the parent to create the space and the safety for that child, for your child, to explore that pain, to process that pain, and to embark on that journey. They need to feel your support no matter what. And their origins and their original family should not be seen as a threat, but as an inherent part of who they are, and that you would not have your child if not for the parents and the original country and people. So love is not enough. Don't see their origins as a threat. And it is your responsibility to cultivate the conversation and the space so that adoptee can fully be authentic and be who they were meant to be. So that would be my advice. And then as far as like what I'm the most proud of, I mean, to be cliche, I think at this point it's my marriage and my children. But as far as an artist, I'm actually really excited about this project, Empress Han. I'm hoping to release it next year. I'm not totally sure exactly when, but probably sometime during the first half of the year. But I feel like this is the most kind of authentic culmination at this point of my art and my activism, and I'm really excited. And it's kind of new territory for me as well, as far as adapting my poetry to vocals and music, and it's very vulnerable and authentic. And I'm sharing things that I think in the past I've been hesitant to share. So I feel excited about it and being able to put it out there.
All right.
Thank you so much. It's so fun talking with you guys. I feel like we just talk forever. But
well, listen, To quote Audre Lorde, you know, part of her quote is, "Poetry is not a luxury; it's a vital necessity of our existence." Mm-hmm. Right? And I find that with all artists, in terms of like you at age 9, using the poetry to connect with your existence. And so we want to definitely have you back to talk about once your project is released and talk about, because I think we're going to get some follow-up questions from folks who want to know more, but we definitely want to be able to have you back to talk about your project once it's released. And I mean, I just, you know, like, Mila, I mean, give it up. I mean, I've been so excited to have you on the show, and I'm glad.
And let me say this, we really got a taste of history.
Yes.
Really.
We all got to keep learning, right? I'm learning too. So, and I just appreciate you all building this community and this solidarity. I think it just becomes all the more important in the times that we're in, to build these relationships and these connections within our communities and between our communities. So you guys are awesome. I'm so inspired by what you're doing, and I feel so grateful to be a part of this.
Mila Kanomas, thank you so much for being on Speak Out. Yes. You all look out for the project, and if we've had her information scrolling on the screen, and we have it on the website to get in contact with her. And listen, it's been a great show. I'm your host, Jewel L.
And I'm your host, Dino L.
And we just want to remind you that you have a voice, so make sure that you speak out world. Yes.
Right. Yeah.